Dogtown Part 1. 6 weeks later, early 2275. The Interfector looked up and adjusted the slim leather strap across his chest, supposed to be his armor. Between winded breaths, some of the blood dripped down into the corner of his eye, and he immediately attempted to clean it with his ash and blood-covered hand. The pain was a bit more than he was used to, but he knew his audience, so he quickly stopped to endure the pain instead. In one last glance through his stinging eye, he saw the 5 lifeless bodies around him, and finally looked up at the near 100 masked faces above him in the pit arena. He searched around that crowd to reorient himself and found the helm of his colleague, Elite Centurion Carnifex. There he was, the only golden face in that sea of black, and above the rubble pile behind him was that blood-red sky over Denver. He was about to ask Carnifex the question when he heard one of the bodies on the arena floor begin coughing. Beneath the silence and another series of thumps from the rooftop onagers, the voice of Lanius came softly but loudly through the winds. "One remains." Without any word, the Interfector stepped over a small pile of bricks towards the coughing man who'd unfortunately regained consciousness too soon. The hangdog warrior pathetically tried crawling towards the locked gate into the pit upon hearing his slayer's footsteps. Abandoning his reach for one of the 5 other weapons around the arena and towards the impossible escape, the Interfector reached down. The man stopped in resignation to his end, and the Interfector pulled the tribal's long hair up to expose the neck. In one fluid motion, the Interfector slid his blade across the hangdog's neck and looked back up to Lanius. With a grin of satisfaction from proving his own bloodlust, he finally asked the beast his question. "Who's up next?" The next day. Another day on the siege line, and not much changed. The wait was getting tiresome for many on the Legion's rooftop fortresses surrounding the hangdog skyscrapers. The dogs below continued to howl and whine in the streets, trying desperately to get at the legionaries in their fortified outposts above the ground. And the Legion's catapults continued to thump throughout the day as they launched flaming boulders and chunks of ruins at the downtown high-rises. Beneath another scream of distant victims, Montano stepped up to Elite Centurion Lanius. With a salute, Montano dropped to one knee and asked the Golden Mask, "My Lord Carnifex, I request permission to receive the honor of the Prime below on your behalf." The golden-bearded mask of the giant turned slowly to Montano, who looked into the mask's black eyes and was given the permission telepathically. Montano arose and the mask slowly turned back to the Prime Legionary in the arena below. Montano briefly looked at all the other soldiers sitting along the edges of the ruin around the pit. Many sat with their feet hung over the edge and held their weapons by their side, looking down at their courageous comrades bringing glory to Caesar in the monotony of the siege. Montano approached the edge of Lanius's platform and said to the Prime below over another crack of thunder, "Speak your intention, legionary." The Prime below raised his blade to his forehead in salute and lowered it before replying, "My Primus Centurion Montano, I request your permission to slaughter, or be slaughtered to bring you honor and raise the glory of Elite Centurion Lord Carnifex under the name of Caesar and the Eastern Front." "Permission granted," shouted Montano to the soldier below before saying, "Befitting your desire, I have summoned 3 of the best hangdog warriors we've captured to act as your adversary. Bring Caesar the honor you intend or die." The soldier below gave another salute to Montano atop the platform. Montano returned one to the aspiring duelist and motioned for the gate operators. 2 veterans pulled on the levers, and the small metal gate below the platform creaked open to reveal 3 tribal warriors in light leather and patchwork metal armor, each one carrying a different weapon. One of the sneering hangdogs held a sledgehammer, another held a legionary's machete, and another carried 2 hatchets. The 2 stepped forward in the arena and did an about-face to look up at Montano as instructed by the slave masters. The 2 did not salute, but lowered their weapons like they were told, and Montano spoke to the 3. "Your courage has been noted in battle by myself and Elite Centurion Lord Carnifex. With this fight, you enemies of Caesar will be pardoned for your actions against him if victorious, and earn a place in his favor." The 3 enemy warriors nodded ever so slightly, and Montano concluded, "Let's hope you 3 are better in combat than you are with dogs." The 3 turned around to face the lone Prime, and as soon as they did, a bell chimed beneath another thump from a nearby catapult. Blow after blow was taken between all parties in the fight below, and each masked soldier in the audience looked into the pit taking mental notes on the strategies and tactics of all. The three hangdogs were clearly very skilled, and the Prime had been known to fight at the level of a veteran's savagery. Each injury inflicted or sustained at the start was minimal as the three fenced, and the Prime differed in his adversaries by one single fact. Pain, no matter how small, only made the Prime more vicious in his offense. It was very hard for a single man to keep three opponents constantly on the defensive, but that was something the Legion excelled at. By the time all four were bloodied and bruised, no mortal injuries were sustained by any, and it was clear only a minute in that the three hangdogs were becoming winded. In what appeared to be a burst of energy, the hangdog with the hammer went for a killing blow on the Prime, while the young legionary was busy slashing away at the machete-wielding tribal. At the last millisecond, the Prime threw himself completely on the machete wielder and narrowly avoided having his skull crushed as the hammer grazed his back. The machete wielder, taken by surprise in the action, found himself even more surprised when the Prime drove his blade into his abdomen. The hammer warrior recovered from the death swing, saw his opponent on the ground, and attempted to smash his back, only to find that he was smashing the back of his killed ally, being used as a shield from his place on the floor. The warrior with the dual hatchets attempted to get at the head of the Prime, but was instantly tripped by the Prime's stray foot, and in the moment between blows from the hammer, the young Prime thrust the body shield off himself, and instead of getting his footing, drove his blade once more into another adversary. The man with the hammer fell to the ground as the Prime yanked his blade out of the warrior's abdomen, but the second he turned to the hatchetman, he felt a blow. The hatchetman had recovered from the trip and lodged one of his axes into the calf of the Prime, not enough to kill him, but certainly enough to make the leg temporarily useless. The Prime's leg buckled under him, and he fell to the floor of the arena, dragging the hatchetman with him. Swing after swing was given to the last hangdog, and the tribal man parried each one as he kicked and shuffled away from the crawling but frenzied Prime. Just before being backed into the wall, the hangdog got his footing and sprung away from the Prime, who again tripped the man with his hacked leg. An audible crunching sound was made as the Prime floored the hangdog, and the two fought viciously on the ground, neither one able to land their weapons on the other. As the brawl continued, the arena floor was spattered even more with blood, and almost all eyes were locked on the thick stream of blood from the killed warrior with the hammer to the site of the brawl. Just as the Prime finally found himself in the position of victory atop the man, he raised the blade above his head, ready to open the throat of the final hangdog. The hangdog, though more than exhausted, still spat flame and was ready to meet his end as he looked into the eyes of the Prime when Montano's voice echoed throughout the arena. Halt. The Prime kept his weapon raised, and the cut and bruised hangdog beneath him breathed heavily, unable to move from the pinned state. Montano examined the arena and that trail of blood with a wary eye for several long seconds. Something was amiss. Montano finally ordered again over the silence, "Hangdog, drop your weapons." The hangdog set his weapons down on the arena floor beside himself and looked past his executioner on top of him to see a pair of rifles aimed at his head from the arena masters. Montano ordered once more, "Prime, stand yourself up." The Prime lowered his weapon slightly and stood from the man beneath him with a triumphant grin on his face before immediately feeling his injured leg give out from under him. Though the Prime never screamed, the pain was horrendous, and his leg's transverse fracture nearly became a complete compound fracture as he tumbled to the ground. Without word, Montano signaled for two slave healers under escort to carry the young Prime out of the arena, who protested bitterly while internally thanking Mars for not letting the wound become compound. A minute later, the Prime was getting booked for a new place in the Recuperatio Unitatis, having narrowly avoided a demise for uselessness despite the victory. But what was to come of the warrior who landed the terrible blow but still found himself in the position of defeat? Before the Prime had left the gate, Montano had turned back to Carnifex, who did nothing but raise his hand and gesture to the man across the arena pit on the opposite platform. Montano looked across the pit to see the Interfector and his subordinate sitting side by side. The Interfector, seeing the whole show and watching the gesture from his colleague, stood and approached the edge of the arena as Montano gave an order to the hangdog. "Hangdog, rise and face elite Centurion Lord Interfector of Phoenix." The default victor stood himself up and faced the new Legion official he didn't know or care to know, still clearly out of the element from so narrowly avoiding death. He looked up at the tall plume of horizontal red above him, and the voice of Montano sounded again. Lord Interfector of Phoenix, I have made the call to spare the profligate below for admirable actions against a man who was in a position to kill at the expense of his station. Blood has been paid and honor has been achieved, and my primus, Elite Centurion Carnifex, has handed the judgment of fate to your authority. Lord Interfector raised his hand in a sign of acknowledgement to Montano, and leaned on the edge of the platform to look at the hangdog who was busy looking at the ground, still trying to collect his breath. The Interfector stayed silent, waiting patiently for the hangdog to get the cue to meet his eyes. Not more than a few silent seconds passed before the head arena master barked, You will meet the eyes of an elite for address slave, as a series of rifles were racked. The hangdog was surprised by the order more out of ignorance than defiance, and the winded man immediately looked up to the elite of Phoenix. Upon meeting the eyes beneath that black and red helmet, the elite leaned on the railing in a casual manner as he said, You knocked a good man out of the fight. It would appear there's a vacancy in the ranks of Centurion Montano's century. Montano kept his composure but gulped, though he would have done as the Interfector required. Montano was more inclined to finish what the young prime started, since he'd only really stopped the fight out of an emergency effort to assess the health of his glory-seeking prime. The complete collapse of the prime's leg was rather unexpected, but resuming the fight after that would have sucked all the honor out of the battle. If the prime was all right, it would have been totally unfair for Montano to order the prime to take his place back on top of the hangdog for the killing blow. Still, the injury of the prime was enough to have him reassigned, and delivering a wound like that demanded some kind of reward, even if the inflictor found himself in the position of defeat. Montano assured himself that whatever the Interfector deemed fit would be fine, especially since the judgment was handed to him by Elenius. The Interfector continued, I do not deem your life worthy of being spared since you delivered such a crippling injury to the prime, yet still found yourself in the position of defeat. The hangdog briefly saw all the rifles being aimed at him out of the corner of his eye, and awaited the volley to pierce his person before the elite went on. But I'll tell you what, you will be spared by the authority of Caesar on one condition. All in the crowd were silent in their usual way, and the hangdog mentally asked what that condition was, not knowing the Legion in general was very big on offering conditions to those they captured. The elite answered the question with another question, How good are you really with dogs? Less than a minute later, the hangdog was dragged out of the arena in chains under the Interfector's order to his private staff. Keep him at the rear of the line on standby for shipment to one of the local camps. Don't fuck up his head too badly. We'll need those crazies' expertise for these Denver monsters. Fucking things use our dogs as chew toys. Oh, and give that man a new name. Something Roman, something like Maximus, or Mark, or Antony, or some shit. I'd say he earned it, wouldn't you? The next day is at the request of Centurion Aileron, direct subordinate of Lord Interfector of Phoenix, that this recent capture from the streets below is tested for worthiness as a fitting trophy for Lord Caesar in his imminent conquest of Denver. The masked and helmetless veteran paused and turned towards the platform where Lanius, Montano, and 5 of the 10 other Centurions of the siege line were standing or sitting. Centurion Montano, I understand you have supplied the adversary in this trial of valor and worthiness. Is this correct? Montano stood from his spot near Lanius and shouted to the man in the pit. Correct. Any gift to Lord Caesar must demonstrate its worth. My century has supplied 4 untamable monsters for the trial. Does Centurion Aileron deem this adversary sufficient? Any less would certainly be an insult to Lord Caesar. Aileron stood from his place beside the Interfector across the arena, took a step forward, and honestly did wonder whether or not his prize would be able to handle the fight. Finding the hound in a locked police compound as part of a chariot patrol, he honestly had no idea if the strange dog would be able to fight against his rabid brothers and sisters from the Denver streets. How a dog like this one was even born or survived in the compound was a mystery to all, but capturing a dog like that was so rare, even in the dog-flooded streets of the ruined metropolis. Still, Aileron agreed that the dog should be given a trial of worthiness, but he didn't expect 4 to be the number of adversaries, let alone have Montano supply them. There was still zero amount of intent to back down from a challenge proposed by Montano, so upon locking eyes with his adversary across the pit, Aileron said, Agreed. The hound will prove its value to Caesar or die. The legionary exited the arena as the trophy dog was brought into the center by 4 men who kept the thing at bay on long rods. The dog certainly was a unique one even by Denver standards, and all eyes on the pit were partially wondering if this was an actual dog or some kind of joke. It certainly snarled and moved like a dog, and made the 4 legionaries have a rough time keeping it in place. As the legionaries maneuvered towards the gate and rapidly departed past the small fence, all the eyes looking into the arena pit were still mentally asking themselves, if this is a dog, why is it half metal? Some of the chariot crews had encountered similar dogs in the streets of Denver, but never managed to capture them. The mechanical dogs were difficult to study by these crews due to the other hounds of Denver rapidly swarming over to devour anything recently killed, and the half-robotic dogs were no exception. In the end, none of the Legion eyes looking at Aileron's recently detained robotic dog knew what to make of it, and neither did Aileron. His trophy was a mystery, and despite the hound behaving like a frenzied mongrel, Aileron and the Interfector wondered if there was something more to the robotic dog as they looked into the brain hovering above its head in a glass dome. When everyone had a good look at the strange dog, the handlers had departed, and it was seeming to calm down as it was apparently ignoring the 100 masked faces above it. That all ended when Montano arose to look over the hound, and both duelists met eyes once more, agreeing mentally to see how this plays out, as both were curious about the mechanical dog. When Montano arose, the gate beneath him creaked open to reveal the 4 Denver hounds summoned for the trial. Without handlers, the mongrels emerged from the blackness and threw themselves at the chain gate, blocking them from the mechanical dog, who surprisingly stayed in place rather than join in the barking match. Denver hounds had been nearly impossible for legionary handlers to tame, but their capture was still ordered by the Interfector, who'd seen the hangdog's immunity to their viciousness early on arrival in the city. The ferocity of the Denver mongrels was seen by all, and so the stockpile of dogs was to be used in the siege line for entertainment, while the Legion awaited the proper moment to assimilate the current human occupiers of Denver. When the dogs had enough barking, the 4 hounds began biting at each other, clearly growing tired of waiting for their robotic meal due to their present hunger. As soon as this was noticed, the arena master gave the signal, the chain gates opened, and the mongrels immediately turned their attention to the robodog. Many accounts say that what happened in that arena pit wasn't a beast fight, but a symbol of man's progress versus merciless nature. No mercy was shown on either side as the beast mankind altered battled the terrors of nature and radiation. The robotic dog instantly crushed the entire neck of the biggest mongrel, but that wasn't enough. The 3 other mongrels leapt upon the cyber dog and ripped and tore at the flesh parts before it freed itself using its hydraulic-powered legs to send one of the mongrels on its rear across the arena floor. The other 2 mongrels lost their grip on the trophy hound and couldn't regain that grip as their teeth were made dull in effort to bite the metal upper neck. One of the mongrels must have suffered a terrible injury in attempt to get one of the robotic legs because it wandered away with a mouth pouring blood, whining all the while. The dog that was kicked had recovered from the blow but limped towards the robot hound, having suffered a broken leg or 2, but the one-on-one action was more than fine for Aileron's trophy. Amidst a flurry of dust, ash, fur, and blood, the robot dog leaped from the cloud and mangled the dog with the broken limbs. The debris settled to reveal a second killed mongrel lying where the cyber dog leaped from, and before anyone knew it, the robotic dog had ripped one of the crippled hound's legs off. Despite this horror, the 3-legged monster fought viciously on the ground and got a good bite on the trophy hound's exposed lower neck. The yelp from that robotic hound echoed throughout all of Denver and below another clap of thunder. The trophy dog had sunk its teeth into the mangled dog's neck again and released its grip, taking an enormous chunk of neck with. When the robot dog lifted its head from the 3rd dead mongrel, dirt and ash covered the beast and blood coated the brain case. The mongrel with the shattered jaw was all that remained, and it was still walking around the arena trying to get away from the mechanical monster. The final mongrel whined and yelped in pain as it stood on its hind legs and clawed at the stakes and barbed wire around the arena walls, asking for help from the legionaries staring down at it. The last mongrel was a pitiable sight, and the Interfector, being the only one capable of feeling this way, felt bad for the monster that would have gladly devoured him if it weren't for its crippled maw. As almost all eyes were looking at the whining mongrel, everyone's attention was suddenly diverted to the robodog. Aileron's trophy hound had killed the third dog and was currently sitting on its hind legs as it panted and looked around at all the mass faces above it. One would have expected the dog to eliminate the last mongrel in the arena, but that wasn't the intention of that modified hound. What many couldn't understand was that the threat alone had been eliminated, so that was it for the machine. The robotic dog sat there in the arena with the corpses of the other mongrels around him in something of an idle state. That last mongrel continued to whine and attempt to free itself from the arena, and nobody knew what to do. The Interfector stood from the platform and attempted to order the Robodog to kill the last one in a way you would order a Protectron or Sentrybot. But the robotic hound looked at the order giver and tilted its head in confusion, as if simply unable to understand the directive. Aileron was the first to realize what was happening as he looked at the mangled dog corpses around it and realized the dog had proven its worth. The dog was a defender of the people of Denver, a neutralizer of hostility, and a perfect new member of Kaiser's Praetorian Guard. The final mongrel was shot by the arena masters, and Aileron had the robotic hound brought to him without chains. With a little kindness, the dog came peacefully, and Aileron painted a little Red Bull on the pup's chassis while glancing across the way at Montano, who remained somewhat intrigued despite the loss of his captive hounds. A dog worthy of service to Kaiser indeed. The Interfector had the trophy sent to Kaiser in the southeast with a note saying this trophy of Denver was the king of hounds. The next day. Another day of waiting on the siege line and yet another day of bread and circuses for the soldiers waiting in the rooftop outposts. The hangdog skyscrapers continued to be wrapped in flame as more and more flaming boulders and rubble were hurled at them by the rooftop catapults. The chariots continued their patrols through the streets below, and more siege engines were constructed for whenever the final assault would happen. Still with no sign of surrender, the hangdogs sent small raids at the line backed by their four-legged allies that did more damage to the Legion forces than their warriors ever did. Many of the Legion's routes into the city were continuing to be fortified as the besieging forces were themselves still besieged by the creatures of Denver. Despite the situation, the Legion was in a waiting game. Logistics and supplies were hindered all along the line. But much of this was due to the terrible situation in Denver itself, rather than the inefficiency of this encirclement. Though the forces encircling Denver were under dual leadership, the Interfector and Carnifex or Lanius worked relatively well together despite one being more patient than the other. Lanius agreed with the Interfector's assessment in that a legitimate siege was needed to help break such a fortified enemy. But by this time, the siege was on the verge of becoming too costly to handle, even for Lanius. Though losses were relatively few in the grand scheme of this front, the patience of Lanius was running thin. With both commanders in charge of the forces under their own specialty, the monster of the East was at the point that he could no longer see any need to continue the siege, especially with supplies still entering the city only ever so slowly. The Interfector still had his reasons for waiting before an assault, but even those reasons were becoming harder to understand in the eyes of Lanius. At the same time, neither commander had heard from Kaiser in the past week, and the only news they heard was that Kaiser had taken direct control of some forces in the Far East after more talks with the Midwest. Brotherhood of Steel went south. Tensions were rising with that alternate faction, and though no hostility had broken out yet, the siege of Denver was still going strong with little progress. The two commanders understood that a siege could not break the spirits of a tribe like the Hangdogs, especially since their allies were able to do most of the fighting. But the Interfector felt that every day in siege was one more saved legionary for when the final assault actually commenced. It was the day after the trophy dog fight that elite Centurion Carnifex decided to show his colleague that there was no point waiting anymore through the only way he knew how. The Interfector of Phoenix leaned on the platform looking down at his company commander in the pit below. He told Carnifex that he would allow his armor to be worn given the challenge he requested, but Lanius declined without word. The recently characterized monster of the East stood looking up at the Interfector with only his helmet and greaves on. The thick golden chestplate and long red cape were removed, exposing a torso clearly made of stone, despite all the dark red scars across it. With one last look at the now 200 faces around the pit arena, the Interfector met the black eyes of the golden mask below and asked, "Elite Centurion Lord Carnifex, state your desired challenge and honor intent before the banner. The monster below raised his hand to the Interfector and held out 5 fingers in a sideways gesture to indicate a challenge of 10. As for the honor intent, the beast only replied with a breath of hot air out the mouth slit on his golden mask that merged with the cold air as he raised his hands to the sky. The helmet slowly turned up to face the blood-red sky of another morning in the fire-engulfed city as the word Mars echoed terrifyingly through the ears of everyone there. After that bone-chilling word from that giant monster of a person, the elite of Phoenix gestured to the arena masters and spoke over the creak of the opposition gate. Elite Centurion Lord Carnifex has requested the opportunity to slay 10 men in honorable arena combat in the name of Caesar under the authority of Mars. As he spoke, the chain gate opened as well, and one by one, 10 men emerged from the blackness and into the pit arena. Seeming to already understand that the 10 of them were against one man, the gaggle of lightly armed slaves and captures entered the arena and took places all around it to encircle him. Despite this confidence in the challengers, several of their faces twisted to unease or even fright as they looked at their sole opposition. When all were in place, the head arena master gave the signal for all the challengers to face the Interfector's direction, and all of them looked up at the elite of Phoenix standing above the bull banner draping down the platform. When all were facing him, the monster remained silent and like a statue, facing the gate they all emerged from. The Interfector addressed the doomed men as required. By the order of Caesar, the 10 of you shall fight elite Centurion Lord Carnifex for the chance at freedom and pardon in the eyes of Caesar if victorious. Another series of catapults gave their signature sound as they hurled their payloads at the distant high-rises. Many of you come from the slave pens, some of you come from the soon-to-be-destroyed hangdogs, but all of you come to this pit to kill or die under the banner of the bull. Some of the slaves glanced at the statue in the center of the arena, and some of the more confident ones became a little more fearful when they noticed the monster had not moved 1 centimeter. The elite of Phoenix concluded plainly, "May this fight free you one way or another." At that, the monster had picked up a fire axe from the ground beside him, holding it in one hand. At the same time, the arena master gave a signal, the horn blew, and all 10 men charged screaming at the axe-wielding statue. There are no accurate accounts of what happened when the monster of the East took on 10 men in the arena. Stories vary from person to person, but all we do know is that whatever happened in the arena was enough to astound and wow the entire audience. Many in that audience were recruits from across the line, recently assimilated from fallen Colorado tribes. And plenty were Legion babies that had heard of the monster's ruthlessness across Colorado before arriving at Denver. Either way, the description of what happened was pieced together from a number of sources, and no matter the hyperbolic details, the conclusion was the same. It was a complete and total slaughter. However, this shouldn't be too big a surprise since, if the monster of the East was indeed the Hydebark giant who turned on his own tribe for Lord Caesar, we know that it takes at least 15 to render him immobile. But those 15 wouldn't be walking away either. When the first slave warrior was close enough, the monster of the East had already buried his axe into his skull and smashed one man into another. With 2 out of the fight before a blink, a third was recovering, some of the slower ones had backed off, and the monster found himself surrounded by 4. As the beast decapitated one of the warriors, he was blind to the one behind him until he felt an axe land in his back shoulder. More angry at the injury than anything, Lanius turned around to the warrior who landed the blow and thus disarmed him. As the warrior felt his axe leave his grip by the turning of Lanius, he couldn't believe that the blow he landed only managed to disarm himself. The poor soul couldn't be wowed for long because he too found himself without a head in an instant. 6 remained, still semi-distant, mentally daring the other to take the initiative as they looked at the axe blade sticking out of their enemy's back. They waited too long, but it wasn't their fault because they were paralyzed in fear as they watched yet another one of their comrades lose his head. The beast then turned around to face the other 6 holding the head of the most recent victim, and when he was completely turned, the 6 gathered another burst of confidence. The 6 ran at Lanius, but the closest man was immediately knocked unconscious when Lanius chucked the decapitated head at him, and 3 others backed off too, focused on how it was possible for someone to knock a man out of a fight with a severed head, while the other 2 continued their charge. That would by no means be the most terrifying thing to happen, because Lanius then slammed his axe into the shoulder of the nearest warrior. A scream of agony was carried in the wind, and before the other charger could see what was happening, he found himself floored. The dust settled, and Lanius was holding the legs of the screaming man as he beat the other one with the body. The remaining three had recovered from the head incident only to focus in and find the monster beating a man to death with the body of a screaming man. Blow after blow was given, and the screaming stopped when the skull of the giant's new weapon was shattered, and he continued to beat the man on the ground with the corpse until all was silent. After that, the remaining three were well aware of their coming end. So, like the mongrel seen the day before, the three slave warriors ran around the arena trying desperately to find some way out, trying to climb the sharpened stakes only to be tangled in the barbed wire above. Slowly, the monster of the east had set down his body weapon and gripped his axe again to finish the job on the man rendered unconscious by a head. After that, he approached one of the fleeing men, the footsteps echoing throughout the ruin. Just as the monster was within reach, the next victim turned around and attempted the most pathetic stab in the monster's gut, only to find his knife bent upon meeting the abdomen. Lanius casually lifted up the assailant by his arms and impaled him on one of the sharpened stakes he was trying to climb a second ago. The last two saw this and looked at each other, coming to some mutual agreement to quit their futile attempt at escape and to go down fighting. In this last hopeless attempt at victory, the two charged Lanius, and one was again instantly decapitated in one swing. This time, instead of waiting for the blow, Lanius marched slowly towards the last man, who immediately began a retreat upon seeing what happened to the other. His retreat found him swinging his blade chaotically, only missing because of his steps backward as the monster got closer and closer. Finally, the man found the stakes of the arena edge at his back, and when the monster was within 6 feet, the man instantly dropped to his knees, weeping and begging for mercy. All across the arena, the bodies of men and their heads were laying in enormous pools of blood, and the beast stopped just before his last victim, as the piercing wails echoed throughout the city. The sound was so penetrating and so desperate that the Interfector found himself trying to order a halt to the fight. But he was still wondering how it was possible to beat a man to death with the body of another man. The Interfector managed to sputter the command to halt, but his mouth was too dry from being hung open for so long that it came out as a soft, unintelligible noise. As he swallowed to dampen his throat, the second the word halt left his lips, Lanius had already silenced the remaining man by kicking him into the sharpened stake behind him. The last plead for mercy entered the Interfector's ears, the second the halt order entered Carnifex's ears, and the golden mask slowly raised to the platform above. Lord Interfector looked into the black eyes of the mask surrounded by bodies across the arena floor and thought about the age-old question: how many 8-year-olds can you beat up at any given time? That appeared to be the most adequate summary of what happened. 10 highly skilled warriors and slaves fighting for their freedom stood absolutely no chance against the monster below, and it wasn't even fair. It was just a slaughter for the sake of it. As the Interfector looked into the black eyes, the monster approached the center of the arena and did an about-face to look at the platform again, and yanked the axe blade out of his shoulder as he said to Lord Interfector, "Gather your Centurions across the line. You will meet in my quarter tomorrow to discuss the hangdog's end." The gate creaked open, and the beast walked through it as a cleanup crew began their work on the 10 fallen men below. Dogtown Part 2. The next day, Lord Interfector stood beside Lanius with Alaron on his other side, and the other 10 Centurions under their shared command taking in the same view as the elites. The large crowd of staff officers stood behind their prospective commanders on the edge of the rooftop outpost looking out over the city. Another series of catapults launched their flaming cargoes at the high-rises nearly a mile off, and all of the commanders watched the flame trails approach steadily towards the hangdog fortifications before smashing on the steel girders and concrete ruins of the 2 towers. The hangdog high-rises were an impressive and solid fortification. The hollow old towers were occupied by over 1,000 in their tribe, and since the siege began, it had been an all-hands-on-deck situation. As each boulder smashed against the fortifications, the fires spread only to be subdued within a few minutes before they could spread. Although the continuous bombardment was still taking its toll over the weeks of siege, the situation on the Legion's end wasn't much better. Since the siege began, it had been an enormous drain on energy and time. Even if it wasn't the most manpower-draining siege, the Legion had ever done. Scouting of Denver since the first march into Colorado showed just how dangerous the city was, and preparations to mitigate the danger were put in place for almost as long as the campaign itself. As the boulders landed, hangdogs scrambled across the catwalks and platforms between the twin high-rises, and Lord Interfector looked down at the streets below. Why was the city so dangerous? Was a question that didn't stick in the minds of new legionaries very long, since looking down at the streets below showed an endless horde of vicious mongrels for which the city was named. Denver was an old-world city that had lost its human inhabitants in the bombs, only for man's best friend to take over and completely occupy the ruins. Where so many hounds came from was a mystery, but the city had been known for decades by the name Dogtown for exactly that reason. Half-mutated mongrels owned the city, endlessly roaming the streets and fighting other packs for food, only uniting in the event that trespassers entered the limits. Even the scores of deathclaws that roamed the eastern ruins had a tremendously difficult time waging their war against the endless hordes of dogs, and were very much appreciative for the Legion distraction in recent days, even if they couldn't express it. Since the Legion entered the city nearly 7 weeks prior, the forces of Caesar found themselves in a very unique situation. While they began their siege of the hangdogs in the center of town, the Legion very quickly discovered that they were being besieged as well. The initial outposts across the line were built on the rooftops of the structures of downtown, and as the fortifications were erected and the siege engines were built, the masses of dogs surrounding each outpost along the line grew bigger and bigger. For the first days of the siege, the hangdogs were safe in their towers and felt they could wait out the encirclement, but as soon as those first onagers were built, panic set in. Though it's unknown how the hangdogs made peace with the four-legged majority of Denver, the situation was seen as a very frustrating one as the weeks went on. The Legion could hardly move due to their own siege, and the onagers did their work, but as the siege continued, resupply and logistics in general were an increasing issue. Once the Interfector's force arrived, they battled their way to Lanius rooftop fortifications with minimal losses, but each dog killed meant 3 more to replace it when they finally arrived to back up Lanius. The seas of mongrels in the streets of Denver below grew and grew as the days went on, and the ground-level fortifications were overwhelmed or broken into on multiple occasions only to be rebuilt by the Legion's expert forces. But something had to be done. The Legion surrounding the hangdogs were well supplied with food from the slain dogs, but ammunition, water, armor, and new blades were in increasingly short supply while the siege went on and on. Each resupply group that came in after the Interfector arrived had to fight their way through more and more rabid hounds, and a small series of slim avenues were quickly constructed for the safe entry of supply forces into the city. Those flimsy barricaded roads were enough for small teams to enter from the outskirts of the city. But by the time those avenues were constructed, the siege had already been going on too long in the eyes of many soldiers and commanders there. Because the Interfector's specialty was logistics and supply, he understood the situation, and though his forces could keep living on dog meat for the next couple months, he too was struggling with exactly how to handle the siege. This indecisiveness came from 2 factors. The longer the siege went on, the more Legion lives he felt he was saving, and though this was true in some respect, he knew that the longer they stayed put, the more losses his forces would accrue against their own besiegers. This was a rock and a hard place for him. Hold the line and save some lives in the assault, or stay put and lose those lives to the dogs of Denver. Those high-rises in the distance continued to be wrapped in black smoke and burn in the continuous bombardment, while intel had just reached them that the hangdog forces cut off in the north had reorganized enough to pose a real threat to the line. This was factor 2. So after nearly 7 weeks of siege, the hangdogs in their home were still holding on. The line was besieged by the creatures of Denver, and the stray hangdog forces were going to attempt breaking through the line in less than a week's time. All this wasn't to mention the danger posed by the Midwest Brotherhood of Steel that had been ramping up their defensive abilities after continuous failed diplomacy with Caesar himself. Lanius or Carnifex was not content to sit on his hands in siege for any longer than necessary, but he was finding it increasingly difficult to figure out exactly how long necessary was. As stated previously, he did work relatively well with the Interfector, so long as both remained in their own roles and focused on their specialties. The only real problem was that Lanius wasn't able to perform his specialties yet. He was an expert in butcher's work, the reason for his name, and a siege offered little opportunity to display such actions. Since the Interfector arrived around a week into the formal siege, Lanius understood the Interfector's assessment in the necessity of an encirclement. But as the days went on with little change in the situation, the Ancien the Butcher became. With the arrival of the Interfector and Caesar's chariots, much of the real work done in the siege was done by the chariot crews. Throughout the days since their arrival, the chariots were dispatched throughout the rubble-filled streets of Denver doing the thing they were outfitted to do specifically for this conflict. With each of the 13 chariots outfitted with cages of barbed wire around the gun or pilot carriages and armored with spike plates around the vital areas, the chariots slowly chugged through the streets between the Legion outposts across the city for the sole purpose of keeping the Denver monsters at bay. Clearing the streets was a simple but relatively effective role, but still didn't seem to do much as more dogs continued to spawn out of the mud and rubble. Each chariot had a driver and 3 gunners locked inside their contraptions as they crawled over the asphalt on daily patrols. Some were even outfitted with bait, large sacks of decaying meat hanging off the sides to lure the Denver hounds to them, while others were outfitted with small wire nets on the back to capture the hounds for either meat or eventual use. As each pack or horde of dogs swarmed the chariots, the crews were largely safe behind their wire fencing as the chariots continued their slow advance while the gunners lobbed spears, stabbed, and shot at the monsters who approached. Countless dogs were crushed by the wheels of these machines, and many more were butchered by the crews on each patrol, but every now and then the forces of Dogtown would become victorious. On a few occasions, mechanical problems would cause the machines to break down, or the carcasses of innumerable dogs would get caught in the wheel wells and render the machines immobile. On the few occasions this happened, the crews were surrounded by too many hounds to be rescued by engineers, and in a city where 1 killed dog was replaced by 2 more. These crews could only go down fighting or pray that the monsters would spare them after obtaining the bait sacks. Few soldiers in Crimson ever escaped the scene after a mechanical breakdown, but those who did usually did so by being less desirable than the mountain of slain dogs around their broken chariot. So, as excellent as these contraptions were at clearing the streets and even capturing Denver's occupants, the swarms of problems around each outpost along the line were by no means ended. Despite all this, the siege was still underway and the hangdog's home continued to taunt each commander, especially the monster of the East. So, with the situation across Denver not changing in many days, and with no new word from Caesar to either commander, the simple question remaining was still lodged primarily in the mind of Lanius and other veteran commanders of the meat grinder. Have we waited long enough? With his display of slaughter at the end of week 6, Lanius felt it was time, so there they all stood on the primary encampment on the south end of the line, overlooking the smoking high-rises. As the Interfector, Lanius, Aileron, Montano, and the 9 other Centurions of the surrounding force stood on that rooftop, they remained silent the whole time, watching the flaming payload soar towards the hangdog high-rises and looking down into the hound-flooded streets below. More boulders smashed upon the skyscrapers and flames spread as the hangdogs scrambled across the interconnected towers like ants. Finally, after nearly 5 minutes of standing, waiting, and watching, Lanius had seen all he needed to. The golden giant turned his helm to the elite of Phoenix beside him. With the duo resembling a blood-spattered metal father looking down at his ash-covered and machete-wielding armored toddler, Lord Carnifex's signature voice echoed out of his terrifying helmet's mouth slit. "Return to my quarter." Even though the address was to the other elite, it was actually to all the commanders. Another succession of catapults gave their sound, and the large group of Centurions and their staff followed Lanius to the monster's quarters, a sizable officer's tent with Caesar's emblem on the open rooftop across a small series of catwalks. Each commander and the 2 elites took their seats in the center of Carnifex's tent, the 12 chairs seated in the same spot as they were during the last meeting there 4 weeks prior. There had been several other meetings of the Centurion commanders, but those were usually done in the Interfector's quarters a half-mile from this one on another rooftop. The Interfector preferred his own quarters for meetings, not only because it was more neat, tidy, and homely than Carnifex's, but because the Interfector preferred to clean up any messes that had been created inside his quarter. Though Aileron didn't mind the several mutilated bodies in the corners, decapitated heads hanging from hooks, horrendous smell, and blinded slave women chained to the tent poles too much. He preferred the Interfector's tent as well, because there was a seat for him in that tent circle during meetings. Although Alaron did understand why Carnifex didn't leave a seat for Alaron, he tried not to think about the fact there was one for Montano. But he again understood that his lack of a seat in Carnifex's quarter was simply because of Alaron's position in the Interfector's staff, not due to personal quarrel. Once all the battlefield centurions were seated, and all the staff members had taken their places behind their prospective centurions. There were at least 60 Legion officers crowded in the tent, and the meeting began. The meeting was simple and much like many of the others before this one. Each centurion was called upon by Lanius, and one by one they gave their unit readiness and status updates. The commanders each covered progress on previous assignments issued at prior meetings, and the sentries assigned the Interfector's chariots went over their vehicles' operational ability, recent acquisitions from the streets, and the state of clearance in their patrol routes. Once all the chariot groups were accounted for in the present, the total operational chariots across the line were 9 strong, having only lost 4 since their arrival in the siege. The Interfector was asked for a reminder of the original amount of chariots brought to the line, and again reminded the monster that 13 arrived in Denver while 1 was totaled in a collision after a mechanical malfunction on the march to Denver. Every time the duelists heard the Interfector's excuse, they cringed, as the Interfector wondered why he'd been asked the question at every meeting since arrival. Either way, the meeting went on, and the Interfector took brief control over the meeting when he used this time to run over the new objectives and patrol routes he had intended for the chariots. All this ended when the monster of the East said, "No, I require their use and your cooperation in the assault tomorrow." This was news to the Interfector as well as all the other commanders there. The Interfector turned from his focus on the chariot-assigned centurions and to the golden mask asking, "Wait, tomorrow?" The monster turned his head slightly to completely face the standing elite of Phoenix as the word, "Yes," came from the mouth slit for all to hear. Lord Interfector immediately asked in all humbleness, "Lord Carnifex, I thought we agreed before my combat in the arena that we would wait for the backup from Circle Junction to arrive." The monster remained silent for a moment, and all the other centurions adjusted idly or uncomfortably before the mask inquired, "And how far out are they?" For a moment, the Interfector was silent as well, knowing the answer, but also knowing Carnifex's answer to that answer. The elite of Phoenix said, "About 2 weeks now if I had to guess." Again, the monster stayed silent for several seconds before answering, "That is too long to wait. The hangdogs north of the city will attempt to break through our line in a matter of days, so the high-rises will fall before they have a chance to prolong this siege. Have a runner divert the Circle Junction force to Caesar near Cheyenne. We'll do without them." Lord Interfector, too, was beginning to feel that 2 weeks was too long to wait since the siege was already going on longer than comfort permitted. But he couldn't shake his feeling that the assault would go terribly or be too costly without those supplemental forces. The murderer also did not care for being ordered to do something by someone he was technically senior to despite being of equivalent rank. The murderer of Phoenix had been an elite of Caesar for far longer than elite Centurion Carnifex, which meant that the Interfector's call was usually the dominant one in similar conflicts of rank. At the same time, however, the Interfector knew exactly who Carnifex or Lanius was. He met him before at that auction all those years ago, and he was fairly certain that he was the Hydebark monster he helped Caesar subjugate. Despite the reputation of Lanius, the elite of Phoenix knew exactly who he was to Caesar as well. Being the head administrator of the Legion's territory, and being directly in charge of logistics and regional governance during so many campaigns or fronts meant that he knew that Lanius was not just a servant of Caesar. He was the right hand of Caesar himself. Spared by Caesar in one way or another, this was a monster who was only part man, was the beast who was sent to succeed where others had failed all across the Colorado campaign. Lanius, even during this time, was the secret right hand of Caesar, a spirit, an entity unknown even to other legates, including Legate Graham. Carnifex was not a man who brought glory to the Legion or gained recognition by excellence in battle. He was the embodiment of Caesar's bloody vengeance on those who defied or failed him. Many battlefield commanders or even legates of the Legion didn't even know the name Carnifex or Lanius until it was too late and they were to be replaced. Lanius was Caesar, a piece of Caesar, Lanius was the part of Edward Sallow that saw the inevitable defeat of the tribe he was chained to and decided to unify that tribe with the nightmarish world around it by being an even more terrible nightmare. The Interfector understood all of this and knew the man or monster he was talking to. He was talking to a part of his own self, the part of himself that betrayed those who trusted him to become a prominent member of the monstrous world that scarred him in his early years. The Interfector silently nodded in agreement, and just as he'd done many years ago, he thought, if the world's going to be consumed in this way, the least I can do is do my best to help consume it. Lord Interfector took his seat and signaled for Aileron to carry out the order. Aileron did so by dispatching one of the staff members as a runner to the Circle Junction forces en route to Denver, and despite the elite agreeing with the monster, he could visibly be seen as unnerved by the plan of assault so soon. After going over the basic rundown of the plan Lanius had been considering for several days, the butcher addressed the Interfector again after seeing the unease in his countenance. "Does the elite of Phoenix have words for me?" The Interfector looked up from his thoughts and met the black eyes of Lanius. "I agree that these hangdogs should be destroyed as soon as possible, but..." He paused and shook his head slightly. "Lord Carnifex, the Brotherhood of Steel is going to be a costly foe to fight, and we can't afford to hold the Denver line and fight the Brotherhood." Lanius interjected calmly but still scarily, "You doubt we will succeed if we assault without the Circle Junction force?" Lord Interfector met the eyes again and immediately replied, "Oh, we'll win if we attack right now. We'll even defend the line if the hangdogs up north attempt a breakthrough tonight. But there won't be many left to fight the Brotherhood." Lanius knew this, and knew that the murderer would still be concerned about the losses even if he accepted the plan as he already did. Lanius said calmly as he stared back into the Interfector's eyes, "That's what the Circle Junction backup is for. Through the use of veterans or not, regardless of the northern force, the hangdogs will fall, and a hangdog surrender will be forced through slaughter in the morning. Their northern hangdogs will be irrelevant after our fight in the high-rises. The Brotherhood will know what we're capable of, and the losses will not matter. Your continued concern for reserves and garrisons across Arizona and New Mexico will prove unneeded when the mere mention of Caesar's name already pacifies those who see our banner." The Interfector sat back, staying calm and cool despite just having his mind and unspoken concerns partially read in front of everyone. He replied softly, "So you know what the kinds of losses on this campaign are turning us into?" Lanius said, "I think you're too sure of what you believe to be true to recognize what Caesar's legion will truly become in the impending conquest. A name alone can be far more terrifying than any amount of soldiers. You should know this better than anyone, murderer." All remained silent for several long seconds as the murderer thought about his own past and the truth in the monster's words. Then he came to the realization that each and every servant of Caesar came to whenever they found themselves worried about the future or what would happen in a coming battle. The Interfector came to that conclusion many times during the march into Colorado, and so many times during the siege, whenever he thought about the problems he had to deal with upon finally returning to his praetorship at Circle Junction. This realization came in the next and last words from Lanius, a stern reminder from the mind of Caesar. The monster said, "Do not underestimate what Caesar can achieve, elite of Phoenix. Leave the future to him, and concern yourself with nothing more than the eradication of our enemy in front." Though the thoughts and concerns would remain in the Interfector's mind, he again knew what was important in the present, and that was what Carnifex had said. The hangdogs would be destroyed, many would die in spectacular glory, and one way or another Caesar would be victorious. Whatever happened in the aftermath of each killing pit would only mean another chance to slaughter till even more blood rained from the sky, and more honor would increase the terror in each name under Caesar's banner. Preparations were done for the attack immediately after the meeting was dismissed as each centurion returned to their units across the line. It is said that one of the greatest elements of the legionary is that they are ready to fight regardless of whatever situation they find themselves in. This fact was true in the fall of Denver too, as each soldier in Crimson had been ready to see the end of the hangdogs or their own since the encirclement began. In the early hours of the next morning, the chariots were staged and ready to begin their roll as the mass of Legion forces congregated at their assigned positions. Beneath the smoke-covered sky and darkness of the early morning, the crude but lethal plan was put into action. It wasn't the most tactical of plans, but it was the most fitting for the conclusion of this front. The Colorado campaign, also known as the Colorado Meat Grinder, was to achieve the bloody end it called for. Each century left behind not more than a single contubernarium to watch over the fortifications and slaves, while everyone else across the line held their weapons at the ready on the ground level of each outpost. The chariots crawled out of the layered gates and into the hound-flooded streets of Denver, grinding up any hound in the way as the gunners kept their weapons quiet, leading the majority of the encircling hounds away from the outposts. The chariots crawled slowly over the rubble-filled streets and along their avenues of advance, each one congregating along the main avenue to the hangdog skyscrapers between the high-rises and the primary encampment of the two elites. Many of the mongrels across downtown Denver were asleep, but when the chariots packed with gunners and supplemental engineer teams reached their positions, the catapults began their bombardment, waking the occupants of the high-rises. More mongrels swarmed towards the whines of their kind and towards the smell of those filled bait bags. As the hangdogs awoke and more hounds swarmed to the defense of their human allies, it was already too late. With the bulk of the Denver mongrels focused on the chariots along each section of the avenue, the route of advance was clear as streams of crimson soldiers marched on the skyscrapers. On each road along the avenue, the chariot crews were holding off what appeared to be hundreds of dogs as the Legion sentries marched up to the foot of the twin high-rises. The catapults unleashed volley after volley like never before as flaming boulders smashed into the buildings and prevented the defenders from doing too much damage to the oncoming forces. As each chariot kept the dogs from the main avenue, groups of slaves and engineers quickly rolled out wire barricades to section off each street and do what they could to keep the mongrels at bay. The wire barricades were by no means a permanent solution, but they would buy plenty of time as the chariots reversed and more dogs became tangled in the wire. Montano straightened his helmet atop his head and embraced the shower of debris as he witnessed another boulder smash into the high-rise above him. With all his soldiers in place, he gave the signal to Aileron, and Aileron screamed up at the driver of a chariot as the Interfector directed his forces around the high-rise plaza. Engineer groups and slaves had finished their construction of the barricades and began laying mines and traps along each intersection as more sentries approached the towers. At Montano's signal and Aileron's order, the charioteer maneuvered his vehicle towards the steel-fortified gate of the first high-rise and locked the machine on the drive position as he leaped off. The chariot sped towards the entrance and slammed straight into the fortified gate of the east tower. The train pilot battering ram attached to the front of the vehicle blew the steel gate off its hinges, and the chariot continued another 20 feet inside the structure before getting stuck in a wall. The vehicle continued to try moving forward with little success, instead flooding the ground level of the high-rise with black smoke. Unable to see what was happening to the ground level's interior, the hangdog defenders of the East Tower didn't have to wait long as Legion forces poured through the smoke and met with the tribals. Montano hacked and slashed away at each man in front of him as the smoke continued to fill his nostrils beneath his tattered mask, and more sentries streamed into the first high-rise while hangdog defenders on other floors poured boiling water and crates of stones onto the legionaries below. 5 minutes into the breach, and the ground floor was secured. More and more forces under Carnifex stormed into the building, and Carnifex, usually being one to be the head of a charge, postponed that routine role in this attack for the moment. Once the tower had been breached, Lanius had ordered the Interfector to take charge of the other before storming towards the open East Tower. Per the plan, Lanius had told the Interfector again to use his own inclination to spare as many civilians as possible when the West Tower was opened because Lanius himself had no intention of showing anyone in the East Tower mercy. Not long after the monster disappeared into the East Tower, Lord Interfector had another chariot maneuvered into position, and the fortified entrance to the West Tower was opened. As the Interfector's sentry under Taurus stormed into the black smoke of the West Tower entrance, Aileron charged into the kill zone as well, leading the Interfector's staff. After one last look at the avenue and all the reserve forces holding the monsters of Denver at bay, he had all the reluctant faith in the world that the remainder of the attack would continue to go as planned before turning around and joining Aileron in the carnage of the West Tower. Floor by floor, the Legion cleared the hangdogs home. After the initial fighting in the ground levels of each structure, the high-rises, as predicted, proved to be a devastating battleground to wage war in. Between the mix of tribal homes and old-world office spaces, floors dedicated to meals, ceremonies, and everything else, the hangdogs fought viciously for each inch of their homes. Many of the tribal non-combatants were in the Interfector's West Tower, but non-combatants were in both, and the two towers were equally defended. By the time Montano reached floor 12, the monster was moving up to floor 13, and every Legion soldier filing up those decayed-old stairwells was completely covered in blood and dirt. At the same time, Aileron and the force he was leading were equally as putrid, but having soldiers separated from their commanders keep watch over the groups of civilians cowering in the corners. When each floor of the West Tower was secure, the legionaries kept watch over the civilians and then escorted them to a designated spot on the second floor as they waited for the black smoke on the ground level to clear. Knowing the Interfector had run past him up to the fighting on the 6th floor, Aileron led the staff up there and watched the elite slam his blade into a hangdog's collarbone. After removing the blade, Aileron saw his Primus turn briefly to face him, breathing heavily and dripping blood before directing a group of legionaries to take charge of a group of huddled children. Stepping towards an opening in the wall facing the East Tower, Aileron approached his commander's side and took in the same view, seeing that the forces under Lanius were already up to nearly the 12th floor. Each tower was around 25 floors, and even though both towers had many completely open floors, the distance and series of catwalks and cranes connecting the two buildings made it hard to tell exactly how much of the tower was claimed. The catapults had ceased their bombardment of the East Tower to focus on the upper floors of the West Tower, and the only way Aileron and his Primus could tell how far up Carnifex's cohort was due to the number of bodies or people being thrown from the windows. Carnifex truly wasn't a man of any mercy, and the bodies continued to fall from the East Tower the higher up they went. The Interfector turned from the opening, both tremendously sickened and savagely prideful, at the image of victory in the east, and marched towards the stairwell and carnage on floor 8. Around 2 hours passed and the Interfector's forces had reached about the same spot as those under Lanius. It was clear that Lanius had encountered some kind of tremendous resistance somewhere around the 20th floor or his tower. But that resistance too was ended as both structures were almost completely occupied by the Legion. At this time, the chariot forces and groups of engineers had just retreated to the shelter of the high-rises after keeping the Hounds of Denver at bay for as long as they could. Many of the wire barricades were broken, and the stray dogs of Denver swarmed towards the East Tower as if they knew to stay away from the West Tower. At some point, while Lanius was clearing the 23rd floor, Montano was ordered to defend the lower floors from the monsters trying to storm the tower. Most of these mongrels' progress was prevented by the simple closing of the building's doors. But many packs of hounds had found their way up, and had to be killed while they feasted upon the countless fallen legionaries across each floor. Many of the hounds that infiltrated the building were just crippled when being dealt with and somewhere in the mess. Lanius had given orders for the dogs, either dead or alive, to be brought up to the combat on the last floor. Montano was in charge of this effort, and by the time they'd brought up many mongrel corpses, the fighting on the top floor was over, and Lanius was slaughtering the last defenders on the roof. At the same time, Lord Interfector and the forces under him had smashed open the door to the West Tower's roof, and the man emerged into the shadowed darkness of another smoke-shrouded and red sky. The sunlight beamed beyond the heavy clouds, but the region was still so dark as that sun's light did little other than tell the murderer that it was around 9 or 10 a.m. As his forces filed onto the rooftop, his staff's Vexillarius took his place on the edge facing the East Tower and fired his gun in the air despite the spray of bullets from the hangdogs on the West Tower roof. The Vexillarius was met with a response from his counterpart on the East high-rise, and the hangdog resistance on both rooftops was quickly silenced. Looking upon the tribal constructions on his rooftop, the Interfector only had to watch as his forces washed over the remaining defenders, silencing the gunshots of the last defenders by indiscriminate fire or merciless hacking. As he walked towards a series of makeshift hangdog structures on the West Tower roof, he saw 3 of his legionaries hauling out the bleeding and bruised remains of 3 hangdogs from a decorated structure. The Interfector had known that the hangdog's leadership was on the West Tower, and briefly wondered why he'd been assigned to handle it instead. Lanius was known as a being who'd leap at the opportunity to slit the throats of conquered tribal chieftains. But all this made sense when he remembered his role in the assault, and when he saw what was happening on the East Tower. The remaining forces under Linnaeus were ripping down the makeshift shacks on the East Tower rooftop like they were nothing, and stacking the debris on an elevated platform that had once been called a helipad. When Lord Interfector looked back at the carnage on his own recently claimed rooftop, his attention was diverted to the 3 men thrown at his feet. Those 3 men hauled out of the structure were the 3 hangdog chieftains who were immediately bound at the feet of the Interfector and propped up. One was clearly in agony, having suffered several gunshot wounds when the legionaries perforated the structures. The injured man collapsed as soon as his legionary escort released his hand, but the body heaved winded breaths over the crackle of fire. The other 2 remained silent, staring at the elite's feet and refusing to make eye contact as Alaron approached his primus's side. When Alaron stepped up, he saw the 3 chieftains, studied the injured one, and glanced at his primus just in time to see the order given. Alaron emptied the remainder of his submachine gun's magazine in the collapsed chieftain, and as soon as he dumped the mag to reload, the chieftain in the middle looked up and spat flame at his conqueror. The elderly man went wild, swearing in his own tongue at the elite who remained calm and waiting for him to settle. The other one continued to refuse eye contact with the Interfector until the legionary behind him was given the signal to end him as well. With 2 of the 3 chieftains now dead, the remaining defiant one finally began shouting at the murderer in English. "You think this is all of us, Legion scum?" The fires across the city grew and grew, and the conqueror of the West Tower remained silent. "Our brothers in the north and brothers of steel will come to our aid." Silence. "You won't leave this tower. Our dogs avenge us below. Ha ha ha." The defiant man cackled. The Interfector and Alaron stayed silent, and the remaining chieftain met the eyes of the elite with pure evil in them. "I hear about you, monster. You kill all us, you all die. We will never bow to Caesar. Kill us for good and dogs will save us." When Lord Interfector felt the chieftain had said all he needed to, he motioned for the team of legionaries to stand him up and march him over to the edge looking out at the East Tower. The man protested aggressively despite his age, and the few dozen other civilians of tribal leadership who survived on the rooftop were walked to the edge as well mid-transport. As the edge of the West Tower rooftop was populated by the survivors of the hangdog leadership and their families, all eyes were focused on the East Tower. The wreckage on the East Tower rooftop was piled on that helipad and set alight. The fire burned and more legionaries shuffled about, with the situation on the other roof being too far to detail. The Interfector removed his binoculars from around his neck and held them to the eyes of the remaining chieftain. Montano marched to the edge of the roaring fire with a crippled and whining Denver hound over his shoulders. The thing protested terribly, trying to bite at him, but failing through the pain in its broken paws and uselessness of teeth against his arm guards. Montano walked at the forefront of the long line of legionaries walking towards the inferno on the helipad from the stairwells into the tower. Each legionary behind him, too, was carrying a crippled or dead hound from the streets below. Montano reached the foot of the helipad, and the squirming rabid monster almost broke free when he caught its legs and silenced it by slamming it against the edge of the helipad. When his rabid mongrel was silenced, he continued up the short steps to the raging inferno and heaved its body upon the flames. As he turned away, he approached the golden monster standing before the inferno at the edge facing the West Tower. Before taking his place, he gave one last look at the file of legionaries, each approaching the inferno with their hounds, before systematically chucking them into the flames. Montano looked across the way at the West Tower, seeing the line of civilians witnessing the deed going on behind the giant, and saw the distant plume of Lord Interfector's helmet before meeting the eyes of the centurion beside him. The old chieftain saw all he needed to, and despite not having binoculars, many civilians knew what was happening on the other tower. The chieftain, unsure whether he was enraged or completely heartbroken, briefly looked down at the streets below, seeing the innumerable dog corpses across the avenue, and still seeing his tribespeople being thrown from the other tower. The elderly man looked one last time at the fire across the way and saw the golden mask beneath the inferno staring back at him in all clarity. He turned to his conqueror, the Lord Interfector, eyes wet and unable to speak clearly as the reality of his tribe's end was finally setting in. Beneath an uproar of sobs from the other hangdogs on the West Tower, the chieftain managed to sputter. Why are you doing this? The Interfector stared into the soul of the chieftain. Why did you think I was the monster of the East you heard about? The chieftain didn't answer. The words of the elite centurion made the old chieftain realize that the conqueror of the West Tower was, in fact, the reasonable alternative to the true monster of the East staring at him from the fire-engulfed East Tower. As the silence provided its own answer, the Interfector saw the realization in the chieftain's eyes, and finally, the elite of Phoenix went on. No, we do not have plans to eat or sustain ourselves on the dogs of this place anymore. What's happening right now is nothing more than punishment. This is a slaughter that will continue for as long as you and your forces in the north resist. All your fallen hounds in the streets below will burn forever alongside your people courtesy of that large gentleman across the way. He gestured to the mask that had not moved as more legionaries on the east roof tossed their hounds on the bonfire. The chieftain remained silent, taking in the Interfector's words. I am not the monster, but you will submit to Kaiser. I will spare you, your people in this tower, and even the souls of your slain monsters under one condition. Still quiet, the Interfector went on after seeing the submission in the chieftain's face. You will formally declare the hangdog submission to your forces in the north, and you will serve Kaiser. For each minute your forces up north remain hostile and threaten our line. More of your people will die and more hounds will be burned. There was nothing but defeat in the old man's eyes. He knew he'd failed his people, and the whine of his tribe's sacred canine allies and friends being tossed into the crackling fire only solidified this message. The Interfector finally concluded, your people, your hangdogs, never existed. Is that understood? No words, merely acceptance in the chieftain's eyes. Your culture, your customs, your skills, your history was never yours. It was ours. Another quiet but clear acceptance was given to the Interfector before he was done. Now, come with me. I'm sure you're eager to meet the true monster and tell your people up north about your new allegiance. The chieftain was escorted down the tower, passing multiple floors full of his subjugated people being escorted mechanically onto the streets below. Upon emerging into the plaza, the avenue was full of slain dogs from the traps laid by the engineer and chariot crews that fell back. As they walked to the East Tower, they passed countless legionary survivors from the battle at the eastern high-rise, carting the corpses of dogs up to the rooftop inferno. By this time, the hangdog people were being separated and segregated on the streets, and the monsters that had broken down the barriers were nowhere to be seen. Almost like magic, the swarms of monsters had retreated to keep their distance, seeming to somehow be fully aware of the surrender agreed to by their tribal masters. A few hours later, an envoy from the hangdog force in the north stepped onto that rooftop and saw his last surviving chieftain standing in chains between the golden monster and elite of Phoenix beside the roaring fire. After taking in the display and sight of his chieftain's condition, the envoy took the order of surrender and departed to relay the terms, mortified by the image of a fire being fueled entirely by their sacred hounds. Once the envoy departed, the Interfector unbound the chieftain at Carnifex's indifference, allowing the man to return to his people in the streets around the West Tower under escort. However, after the complete surrender of his tribe, and after watching more than 300 dogs get added to the fire while they waited for the envoy, he was done. The second the chieftain was unbound, he ran as quickly as he could over to the inferno and threw himself on it. The action was almost unacknowledged by the two elites and nearly expected by both of them. As the old chief joined his hounds in the fire, his screams echoed throughout the city. When the screams finally faded into the distance, Alaron glanced to his primus, then back to the fire as he addressed the centurion next to him. An admirable conquest of the East Tower, Centurion Montano. Montano stayed silent for a moment, staring into the fire alongside his rival before saying idly, I should offer you praise as well, Centurion Alaron. It's good that the West wasn't as fortified as the East, or else Lord Interfector's worries would certainly have come to true realization. Still, keeping the people subdued while fighting in ruin is to be commended, Alaron replied, trying to make out the bones of the chieftain in the fire. Perhaps the resistance in the East would have been less costly if the occupants didn't fear getting tossed from windows in the event of defeat. Montano straightened his helmet and tucked the unfurled head wrap back inside as he looked back into the fire from Lanius. I'll make sure to inform Elite Centurion Carnifex about your tactical advice, Alaron. Without breaking from the fire, Alaron adjusted his armor, feeling some of his thermite-burned skin around his shoulders get displaced from repeated blows as he said, "It's not my advice, it's Lord Interfector's." Montano glanced to Alaron before looking past him at the elite of Phoenix and Lanius discussing something. "I'll do you the justice of acknowledging how you perhaps know things that I do not, due to our stations, but know who you follow and where they stand in Caesar's ranks, Alaron." Alaron's view of the fire was obstructed briefly as a man in legionary attire with a black hood walked past them toward the elites. "I'll second that, Montano. Know who you follow, but just know that change is coming with the end of this front. One way or another, the Legion's glory will be tested. Whether that is because of the outcome of this campaign or our next wars is yet to be seen." Both remained silent after that until both of their eyes were diverted to the hooded legionary who handed a letter to the elite of Phoenix. As the Interfector read the letter beside that golden statue, Montano said, "It appears we'll be parting ways again. I'll be marching on the Brotherhood, and you'll return to quell the fires in Lord Interfector's praetorship." Alaron nodded silently, and Montano looked to his rival before adding, "Don't think we've settled our differences. I'm merely impressed you can keep your head on during a battle, something that's fortunate considering I'll be the one to remove it." Alaron refused to look his way, instead continuing to stare into the flame. He replied softly, "You can try, you insubordinate creature. Stay alive on the next front for me. Can't have any paladins stealing the honor I'll receive when I finally gut you." The two stared into the fire together as their words for the other sank in. As the seconds passed, sinister grins crept across each of their faces until the golden monster stormed past and the Interfector stepped up to Alaron with the words, "Alaron, collect my staff and make ready for departure. It's about time we return to Circle Junction." Alaron replied, "Right away, Primus," and jogged off before the Interfector tipped his helmet at Montano. "Montano, I see you two are behaving yourselves." That sinister smile grew across Montano's face again as he replied, "Of course, Lord Interfector," with a fist over his heart. The Interfector returned with a salute and walked away from the rooftop inferno, ready to depart the tower and newly tamed Dogtown.